And hello, hello. Welcome back to Popular Music Books in Process, our series that connects the Journal of Popular Music Studies, the Pop Conference, and IASPM US. I want to also, as I always do, thank my co-organizers, Carl Wilson and Kimberly Mack. We are also have now something like 16 prior, can we call them episodes? Have we hit the point where these are episodes? I don't know what you call these things, events on YouTube. So you can go back and see how the year in books has played out in a couple of weeks, because we thought about it and no one was really looking to present on Election Day. That was my rookie mistake. We will not have anything on Election Day. So 2 weeks from now, we come back with a group of people, part of an edited collection on Billy Joel, who in political terms hangs out with Andrew Cuomo, I believe. So we can we'll slot that where you want. But for today, I'm really happy to have our biggest gathering of book authors to date. Maureen Mahon, Maya Angelou Smith, Francesca Royster, talking about Black Diamond Queens, Black Venuses, and Black Banjos, listening to Black women. On the occasion of Maureen Mahon's book and with books by Maya and Francesca in progress. So I'll say a quick couple of things about each of our speakers and then pass it over to them. Maureen Mahon, a cultural anthropologist. Oh, and then I'll say one last thing at the end. Maureen Mahon, a cultural anthropologist, is an associate professor in the Department of Music at New York University and chairs the SEM Popular Music section. Her previous book is Right to Rock, The Black Rock Coalition and the Cultural Politics of Race. The one newly out is Black Diamond Queens, African American Women and Rock and Roll, 2 books on Duke. Maya Angelou Smith is an associate professor of French at University of Washington. Primarily, she focuses on the intersection of racial and linguistic identity formations among marginalized groups in the Francophone African diaspora, such as in her recent book, Senegal Abroad. But this project brings her to us, Reclaiming Venus, The Many Lives of Alvenia Bridges, for general audiences interested in cultural and social aspects of the entertainment industry. And I'll point out that you got it as part of your advanced material, her presentation for the Pop Conference, a kind of digital lecture, is a great distillation to check out. And then Francesca Royster, author of the great book Sounding Like a No-No, Queer Sounds and Eccentric Acts in the Post-Soul Era, as well as Becoming Cleopatra, Shifting Image of an Icon, professor of English at DePaul University. And from the Journal of Popular Music Studies perspective, we have to note that she just co-edited a really fantastic, I must say, special issue, Uncharted Country, New Views and Perspectives on Country Music. She's currently at work on a memoir on queer motherhood, Fierce Love, and also a project on country music performance and fandom from a Black queer feminist lens, Black Edens, Country Music's Black Queer Frequencies. Welcome to all 3 of you. Final comment before I mute myself. We invite our participants always to put comments in the chat as the conversation goes. And even if a question occurs, just post it in the chat when you think of it. At the end, we'll have time to get back to you. Kimberly Mack will be monitoring the Q&A, but it's great to get it down and we share all the information in the chat with our guests afterwards. All right, everything came through loud and clear? Take it away.
Thank you so much, Eric. And it's just really fun to be part of this conversation. I've been able to dip in and out this fall, and it's just been a saving grace to have a community of people to share work with and talk to. And today I'm really honored to be presenting together with Maureen Mahon and Maya Angelou Smith. And especially as I was reading their work over the last couple of weeks, I mean, I really feel like they're just like the perfect people to be talking with about the work that I'm interested in too. So as we were thinking about our work and how they spoke to one another, definitely the idea of listening to Black women as they resonate audibly and inaudibly, I guess, across genres, but also within genres was on our mind, but especially thinking about the urgency of our work right now. in this particular political, cultural moment, why it's important to think about Black women and to rethink Black women's roles in different aspects of popular music. So we're going to go in the order of, I'll go first, then Maya will share a taste of her work, and then Maureen will talk about her book, Black Diamond Queens. Then we'll have a little conversation, and then we'll open things up to Q&A. So I will go first, and if you'll forgive me, I'm going to read because I'm a reader. Okay, so thank you. And I haven't shared this work with anyone yet, so I'm excited to share a little bit of this. So thank you. Okay, can the Black Banjo speak? Can the Black Banjo speak? Stand with one leg rolled up, leg hitched, to follow those broken stoned paths again? The old songs and uncanny melodies that take us to forgotten, shamed places? Tunes and words just beyond the selves we have always been told we should make? To play it for our daughters, to guide their fingers so that they can play it too? Can the Black Banjo speak and be heard? Is it queer to take the time to really learn this language of flail and drone, to find the old tunes and make new tunes, to make ourselves in this homemade music? Is it queer to claim birthright where our place has been long occupied by those who don't see us, to claim a love beyond birth, beyond blood? Can the Black Banjo speak and be heard? Songs of Our Native Daughters, a project first initiated by Rhiannon Giddens in 2018, together with Smithsonian Folkways, amplifies the banjo as a past and contemporary medium of Black expression, understanding, and protest. To use the banjo as a central tool for an album that centers Black women is risky, precisely because of the ways that Black people have been written out of its history. For Songs of Our Native Daughters, Giddens realized that she needed other Black women's voices with her on her journey. And so she called on friends that she had admired from afar and past collaborators to bring this project home. Allison Russell of the Americana folk band Birds of Chicago, who brings a gut 5-string banjo to the album, together with a lilting honey voice and presence. Layla McCullough, solo artist and past Carolina Chocolate Drops member, brings her tenor banjo, lovely multilingual storytelling voice, as well as her cello. Amethyst Kia, a queer solo guitarist with a chest-deep singing style that she calls Southern Gothic alt country blues, contributes vocals, guitar, and a steel string banjo. And Giddens brings her fretless minstrel banjo, a reproduction of a model from the 1850s, and her fiddle. All contribute vocals and songwriting for the album. All bring deep musical and historical knowledge to the songwriting and performance, including the histories and legends from their own homes across the Black diaspora: Johnson City, Tennessee, the Piedmont region of North Carolina, the Caribbean nation of Grenada by way of Montreal, and Haiti by way of New York City. In the summer of 2019, when I heard that Rhiannon Giddens and Our Native Daughters were going to play at the Smithsonian's Museum of African American History in Washington, D.C., I quickly bought tickets for my small family. My partner Annie, our college-aged niece Nietzsche, who was living with us that summer, and our daughter Cece, who was 7. We planned a road trip that would also be a research trip, weaving from Chicago to Cedar Point to Pittsburgh and then Washington, D.C. In Rhiannon Giddens' liner notes for Songs of Our Native Daughters, she writes that one of her inspirations for making the project was a trip to the Smithsonian with her daughter, who was also 7, and encountering the history of slavery through her young eyes. I too had been trying to help my daughter digest this history, despite the erasure of its complexity at school and in popular culture. I had been listening to the album nonstop that summer and playing it for anyone who would listen. And that summer, I began the journey to learn to play the banjo myself, swallowing my pride and my Black girl awkwardness every week to eke out a slow, painful version of Cripple Creek and other tunes, my own small gesture at Black banjo restoration. The lessons were helping me hear and feel the banjo differently, to recognize the interwoven layers, the percussive power of the claw hammer, the funk that could be captured if you were skillful enough, although admittedly, I wasn't yet. I hope I don't run into Trump here, Cece wished out loud as we entered the museum. She had been worried about Trump since we arrived in Washington, D.C. Don't worry, I really doubt that he'd come here, I reassured her. Though the majority of the crowd was African American, we saw many kinds of people there. Old people, young people, many different colors and languages and nationalities. We were all dazzled by the stylish teenagers in diamante-studded jeans and with neon-threaded braids, snazzily dressed elders in tweed despite the heat, different sized bodies and rates of motion, and no Trump in sight. As we moved along with the crowd, we saw an image familiar to me, a wall-sized diagram of the hold of a slave ship during the Middle Passage. Black bodies stacked horizontally and vertically to take up every inch of space, like so many cords of wood. I wondered if this was the first time Cece had seen this image. Cece ran a finger along each body, one after another after another. I gave her a squeeze and we kept moving. I found myself searching for the physical evidence of our resilience, the rituals that fed our spirit and imaginations despite the brutality. With the evening's concert in mind, I was drawn to the musical instruments on display. There was a drum used in the 1739 Stoner Rebellion, carved from the trunk of a single tree. There was a sketch of a ring shout with dancers and a player with a homemade banjo by his side. We saw a fiddle resting in a glass case, and despite the fingerboard worn from playing, the wood dulled in places where hands may have held it close, the instrument seemed to still thrum with life. I told Cece how those instruments were vital for our survival, to keep our bodies and spirits alive, to communicate and connect, and also to resist. So much so that laws were enacted to control their use. The fiddle seemed surprisingly small, and I imagined a child playing it. I imagined it being passed along from generation to generation until it reached Cece and me. After the long day at the museum, the concert felt so necessary. We needed a space to commiserate, to put into words our own feelings of outrage and sadness and loss awakened by the exhibits, to heal and connect. As the lights lowered, the members of Our Native Daughters appeared on stage, each carrying a banjo like a weapon. All four women were wearing matching jeans jackets with a colorful design of four brown silhouettes, a banjo, and the letters O-N-D. "We're a girl gang now," Giddens shouted to our cheers. Giddens described how powerful it was to wear the jackets as they toured the museum earlier that day, making them feel bolder. We reveled in their style, each with their own take on beauty. The warm red and orange stage lights brought out the varying browns of everyone's skin and gave the audience their own dose of melanin. Each musician took turns telling stories, teaming up with one another on the songs that they had co-written. Their pleasure in playing together was evident in their appreciative gazes, their inside jokes and flirtations, and in their shared seriousness as they listened to one another play. As the band launched into Moon Meets the Sun, I got what I'd been waiting for all day. First, Giddens names the damage. "Oh, you steal our children, but we're dancing. Oh, you make us hate our very skin, but we're dancing." Allison Russell leaves the judgment up to God, while Amethyst Kia embraces the stealth of the spider. The smallest will prevail. And with each chorus, those lines, "and we're dancing," answers the lament backed by the bottom of that minstrel banjo, resilience. We could feel it in their own dancing as they sang to us, grounded like Giddens' bare feet. The concert came to a close with the song "You Are Not Alone," a lullaby by Allison Russell, written, she tells the audience, for the young daughters that the women left behind in order to go on tour. And it was a lullaby for us. With Russell's voice tender than swelling with feeling, the rhythms rising and falling in a Cajun waltz, the song itself is a circle. I thought of Cece's yearning to learn more about her birth family that summer. I thought of how excited I am whenever I meet an African person in Chicago and they claim me as their own. the woman in the Ethiopian bead store who giggled as we both struggled to get a string of amber over my very large head. And she said, "You must be Ethiopian. You have a head like ours." How happy that made me. As Brussels sang the lines, "In the cradle of the circle, all the ones who came before you, their strength is yours now, we're not alone. Kia and Giddens banjos, plucking feather-light, a cobweb subtle but strong. Makala's melancholy, sorry, shallow. Whoops. Woven in between. Sorry. I haven't read this out loud before, so I didn't know I was going to get all choked up. Cece whispered, "It feels like they're singing to me." That's all. Okay, I'm going to turn things over now to Maya.
So beautiful, Francesca. Thank you so much for sharing that. It's been an incredible pleasure being part of this Works in Progress series over the past few months, learning about how people write about music and musicians. And so I thank Maureen and Francesca for inviting me into today's talk, since I was originally scheduled for election day and I just would not have been, I would have been a wreck. So thank you so much. As you all may have gathered, I come from a very different academic background, trained as a sociolinguist and ethnographer. However, the opportunity arose to help tell the story of Alvenia Bridges, a woman who spent most of her career behind the scenes in the music industry, and I couldn't pass up this opportunity. And so we are in the process of publishing an ethnographic memoir, predominantly from her point of view, but also from mine as well, in order to provide insight into what it was like for her as a Black woman in rock and roll. And so today I'll be spending a few minutes reading a few excerpts from the book manuscript, which is entitled, at the moment anyway, "Reclaiming Venus, the Many Lives of Alvenia Bridges." So let's see. So this first excerpt is from the prologue, which is in my voice. While waiting for our tea to steep, I started noticing all the photos pinned up on the wall above the table. The breakfast nook was plastered with incredible images, many adorned with beautiful inscriptions. Photos of Bob Marley, signed by his favorite photographer, Kate Simon. Portraits of Roberta Flack with Dizzy Gillespie, with heartfelt notes scribbled in their handwriting. A blown-up copy of a color Polaroid of Jimi Hendrix strumming his red guitar outside his home in Seattle when he was just a boy. This image was juxtaposed with a black and white photo of Jimmy waiting on a bench in an airport, taken shortly before his death. Someone had drawn angel wings on his back with Sharpie. I then noticed a black and white photo of a much younger Alvenia, modeling a stunning dress as she presented the viewer with her profile. The kaleidoscope of images went on, consuming all blank space. "If you think that's impressive, you should see my office," she winked. She then grabbed her mug and beckoned me to follow. It was true. The objects hanging in the breakfast nook were only the tip of the iceberg. She proudly drew my attention to even more impressive memorabilia suspended above her office desk. 2 framed records encased in glass, identical except one gold, the other platinum, with her name engraved next to an image of Mick Jagger's first solo album cover, "She's the Boss." A black and white photo of Mick during the height of his Rolling Stones career. A color photo of Mick huddled together with other rock and roll legends, Tina Turner, Madonna, Bob Dylan, the list went on. A black and white photo of Alvenia and a man I didn't recognize rounded out the series. The 2 of them were looking at each other with immense respect and admiration. The inscription read, don't ever forget how good you are, Bill." I asked Alvenia about these objects that she so lovingly displayed, and each one catapulted her into a distant memory. At first, I didn't know what to expect, but as she casually said things like, "Oh, that's when I was working on Live Aid," or "That's when I was Mick's personal business liaison," or "Roberta was how I got into the music business," or "I was with Jimmy the days leading up to his passing," I would have to stop her and say, "Wait, what?" She would laugh. "Ha, those were from another life, another time. I'll tell you the stories behind them someday soon. All right, so the second excerpt is from Alvenia's perspective and details how she got the opportunity to be a tour manager back in 1979. I paid a visit to James Finney, the first person I contacted anytime I returned to New York. As a hairstylist to some of the most famous Black performers of the era, he could possibly provide some guidance. Besides, I needed my hair done. To this day, I have never let another person touch my hair. However, having Finney do your hair was an experience. People were so desperate to have Finney plaits that they would put up with just about anything. Finney was a character like none other. When you were in his care, you were not allowed to leave the chair other than a few bathroom breaks, no matter how long it took for him to complete his work. It was not inconceivable to be in that chair for 24 hours. If Finney decided he wanted to go to the bar at the corner for a drink, he would tell you, "I'll be back directly." And 2 hours could pass by before he would come sauntering back into his salon with a wide grin on his face. If he got hungry, he would go into the adjoining kitchen and fry himself a chicken. It didn't matter what stage he was at with your hair. It could wait. He would always offer you a choice piece of that bird in exchange for your patience. He also had a television on in every room. He didn't want to miss his soaps while he was working, and his multiple screen setup allowed him to move from room to room and still enjoy a seamless viewing experience. This particular morning, Finney was plaiting my hair and, between long glances at Days of Our Lives, listening to me lament about how fed up I was with fashion. I was on the loose and looking for work. All of a sudden, he swung his own plaits over his shoulder and cocked his head. "You know," he excelled pensively, "I just might have a lead for you. Let me see what I can do." A few days later, Roberta Flack was sitting in the exact same chair I had been and having the exact same style done. Finney plaits were all the rage at this time. Always a reliable friend, Finney casually brought me up in conversation and related how I was looking for a career change. "Is that right?" Roberta responded to his brief monologue. "Where's your phone? I might as well call her since I still need a tour manager and it seems like she needs a job." Finney dug up the phone under a pile of curlers. In this final excerpt, Alvenia describes an experience early on as Mick Jagger's personal business liaison. Roberta Flack took a chance on me when there was really no reason to. Many people in the business expected my failure. What was some fashion model with no music experience going to bring to the high-stress, fast-paced life of the music industry? Furthermore, Roberta was known as the toughest woman in music. She was a serious businesswoman and a musical perfectionist who expected the most out of everybody, especially herself. But high expectations were my fuel source. I relished the challenges and got things done. While I had never had any formal training in the biz until that point, I ended up getting my PhD from Roberta Flack. Roberta taught me everything. And so when Mick Jagger approached me to become his personal business liaison, I knew I was up for the task. "I've heard you're one of the baddest in the business, Alvenia. I could really use someone like you on the road," Mick told me over the phone when trying to make the case for working with him. It gave me immense pride to see that others were taking notice of my abilities. More importantly, Roberta gave me her blessing, content that her protege was spreading her wings. And then I will jump down a little bit. I officially started as Mick's personal business liaison in mid-September of 1981. Basically, if anyone needed to talk to Mick, they would go through me. I set his schedule and made sure he knew about everything from important events to mundane activities. Right before we went on tour, he called at me out of the blue. "I'm sorry to call so late, Alvenia, but would you mind going out with me tonight? I want to check something out." He was always very polite, but not someone I hung out with outside of work, so I was surprised by his invitation. He summoned a car and met me at the front of my apartment building. He then proceeded to spend the whole ride trying to make me laugh at his jokes. It was a thing he did because he knew I never got jokes. And as usual, he failed, even though I appreciated the effort. My brain is just wired differently than everyone else's. Nothing makes this more evident than humor. We soon arrived at a funky club on the Lower East Side called CBGB's, a place that was real cool, real New York, and full of people of all backgrounds. As we made our way backstage, I noticed a petite man with striking eyeliner and a garter belt over his clothes, strutting across the stage almost like a contortionist. He had this amazing range, impressing me with how his voice could linger in the stratosphere. He was a sight to behold. Mick was the one who always found the opening acts for their tours and really liked to push the bar with the groups he showcased. Apparently, this group was starting to make moves on the R&B charts. I thought to myself, I don't know if the world has seen anyone like the lead singer. On the ride back home, Mick asked for my opinion. I couldn't really articulate what I was thinking, so I just said, it was wild. Not another word was spoken about it. It was not until we got to Memorial Coliseum in Los Angeles a few weeks later that I was reunited with that enigma of a man. As an opening act, this mysterious man, supported by his band, started doing his thing, and all of a sudden, 100,000 people went berserk, and not in a good way. By the third song, the audience was throwing things at him and cursing him violently. Bill Graham grabbed the mic and called for security. The poor singer, who was simply ahead of his time, ran off stage. There was sheer and utter chaos while Mick tried to figure out what was going on. As things settled down, he told me to go find our disgraced performer, but he seemed to have vanished without a trace. I found out later he had retreated back to his native Minnesota. However, I had a suspicion that this would not be the last we heard of Prince. Proving my intuition right, he came back with a vengeance. Very few would reach the heights that Prince did. When I learned of his recent passing, I couldn't stop thinking about how the world was robbed of another musical genius. Fortunately for us, Prince continues to change the world with the music he left us. And I will stop there and pass the torch to Maureen.
Thank you. Are you hearing me okay? Okay, I'm never sure if I'm really there. So I want to start by thanking Eric, Carl, and Kimberly for keeping this great series going since the end of June. As Francesca and Maya indicated, it's been very restorative to have this space to gather and to think. And I also want to thank my co-presenters, Maya and Francesca, for going on this voyage together this afternoon. So I'm going to read just to make sure that I say the things I really want to say and stay within our time, the time we set out. So the easiest way for me to introduce the project, and you can see the cover over my shoulder, the easiest way for me to introduce this project is to read a little from the first pages of the book. And I'll preface that by saying that this book is not the book I was planning to write. My first book is an ethnography focused on the Black Rock Coalition, an organization of African-American rock musicians and their supporters, and the ways they use music and activism to challenge the limitations placed on Black expressive culture and Black identity in the 1980s and 1990s. The BRC was arguing against a common sense idea that Black people and rock music did not go together. And it's fortuitous that Maya ended with that image of Prince being bombarded by angry rock fans forced to listen to a Black rock artist. So after publishing that book, I was continuing to do ethnographic research, still with African-American musicians, but with a focus on New York City-based women who were working outside of major labels and outside of what was then defined as Black music in the first decade of the 21st century. As we spoke about their careers and their goals and their challenges, our conversations would often turn to the African-American women musicians who came before them. What were their stories? How did they manage? And I realized that I wanted to learn about those earlier African-American women artists. So I went searching for what Daphne Brooks has called the, quote, Black female voices buried at the bottom of the rock and roll archive, end quote. My new book brings together what I found on that quest. And I want to note, given the company that we're in, that I presented some of my first efforts to think about this material at a pop conference years ago, back in the early days when the museum was still called EMP. I gave a paper on Mary Clayton and other African-American Black background vocalists and their role in late 1960s rock. So let me also say thanks to Eric and Anne for creating such a productive space for all of us to think critically and creatively about pop music. So Black Diamond Queens is made up of 8 chapters, including one on background vocalists. I also talk about Big Mama Thornton, Laverne Baker, the Shirelles, LaBelle, Betty Davis, and of course, the cover figure, Tina Turner. And then I do have a chapter on women who were involved in the rock scene, but not as musicians, but as, although they did some work as musicians, but are primarily known for their relationships with very visible rock stars. And that chapter also takes a close look at the song Brown Sugar. So there's also an introduction to the book, and I'm going to read from the very beginning. Santi White threw down the gauntlet shortly after the 2008 release of her first full-length recording under her moniker Santa Gold. Some music critics were labeling her as an R&B singer, and she was outraged with what she viewed as inaccurate classification of her music. "It's racist," the singer and songwriter told a reporter, quote, "It's totally racist. Everyone is just so shocked that I don't like R&B. Why does R&B keep coming into my interviews? It's pissing me off. I didn't grow up as a big R&B fan, and like, what is the big shocker? It's stupid. In the beginning, I thought that was funny. I'm an MC, I'm a soul singer, I'm a dance hybrid artist," end quote. The songs on Santa Gold feature sly and catchy meldings of ska, reggae, and rock rhythms. There are dub echoes and danceable synthesizer effects, all with White's laid-back, talk-singing vocals riding over the top. White and her producers had created musical settings that drew on everything from 80s new wave to Jamaican dancehall to electronica, but it was a stretch to hear the album as contemporary R&B. White, an African-American woman, argued that commentators assigned her to the genre because of her race, while ignoring her actual sound, and she was not happy about it. Placing Santa Gold into one of the music genre categories set aside for African-American musicians did not make musical sense, but it was part of a long tradition of prioritizing racial identity over musical sound when marketing pop music. Genre categories simplify things for music business professionals, whether at record labels, music venues, or media outlets. They help identify an artist's potential audience and determine how to promote their music. As such, genre labels have a powerful effect on the shape and direction of an artist's career. Concerned with what she viewed as the misrepresentation of her creative work, White resisted the flawed categorization, pointing out that she was being grouped into a style of music for which she had no affinity and to which her genre blending music was only tenuously connected. Santi White is not the first African-American woman to struggle with issues of music genre and professional career. In fact, she is one in a long line of artistically adventurous African-American women whose sounds have shaped the musical and cultural terrain, but whose race and gender identities have made their impact difficult to hear and acknowledge. This has been especially true for women participating in the unruly genre of rock and roll. Since the 1950s, when they were among the rhythm and blues artists who created the music that took the name rock and roll, African-American women have made pivotal contributions to the form as it underwent decades of stylistic and cultural changes. Stories of their involvement in rock and roll, however, have been marginal to the dominant narrative, and, like Santi White, they have been pressed into genres deemed appropriate for African-American women or not talked about at all. Black Diamond Queens, African-American Women in Rock and Roll, discusses the careers of a cross-section of Black women, vocalists, revealing the simultaneous conditions of audibility and inaudibility, of presence and absence that characterize their careers in order to amplify their musical, creative, and critical voices. It may seem unusual to foreground Black women in a discussion of a genre associated with white youth rebellion, the formation of male identities, and a fair amount of misogyny. Unlike the blues, jazz, or soul, rock and roll is a counterintuitive place to look for African American women. It is precisely this apparent disconnect that compels me. Ideas about what rock and roll music is and who is qualified to perform it, in short, the everyday workings of genre classification, have marginalized African American women in discussions of the history of the genre. This is troubling, since Black women have influenced the sound, feel, and image of the music from its beginnings. Still, their involvement is often overlooked as assumptions about music genre and social identity combine to create a narrative that is mostly male and predominantly white. In most mainstream histories of rock and roll, Black women are mentioned only briefly, if at all, and the particularities of their music and experiences are rarely considered. Black Diamond Queens moves Black women to the center of the discussion and listens to the voices of African American women in rock and roll from 1953, when blues singer Big Mama Thornton topped the R&B charts with her hit Hound Dog, to 1984, when the solo career of veteran performer Tina Turner took flight, and she won recognition as the queen of rock and roll. I examined the race, gender, and genre challenges that Thornton, Turner, and a host of others encountered, and explore the interracial and cross-gender collaborations in which they engaged in order to uncover a hidden history of African American women in rock and roll.
Well, maybe I'll jump in and maybe we can talk to each other a little bit about our question that we were all thinking about, which is just the timeliness of our projects, the urgency of the question of listening to and hearing Black women in this particular cultural moment, and how we see our own work doing that. And I'll put out there just as one kind of way of thinking about it. When I was listening to Maya's documentary and then documentary talk, as well as the excerpts from the memoir, and also I had the wonderful chance of reading Maureen's book, I really was thinking about this issue of kind of invisible labor, emotional labor, and otherwise. And there's in Maureen's chapter on backup singers, she kind of talks about this as kind of the role of backup singers that really lend emotional depth and creativity as part of the emotional labor that might describe artistic work or creativity overall. And so at that moment for me kind of pointed to the ways that the role of Alvenia Banks, or the role of these backup singers, is really kind of symbolic of the role of African American women as we've been seeing in mainstream culture. But I also love how both of your projects really complicate that idea. You're not just talking about kind of the help, but really thinking about creativity, resistance, outrage, and all these other aspects that I think are so important to how we hear Black women. So that was kind of my own thoughts.
Yeah, thank you, Francesca. It's funny you bring up emotional labor, because there's so many. It was really hard for me to decide what excerpts to share today, both because of how Alvenia crossed paths with so many of the people that were mentioned in both of your works. Thinking of Tina Turner or Eric Burden or Mick Jagger, or just the list goes on, Betty Davis. But one of the stories that really stood out to me was when Alvenia was present for when Mick reunited with his daughter, Karis. And he kind of sprung it on her in Paris and was like, "Here, come with me. There's someone I need you to meet." And Alvenia was just noticing how sort of fidgety he was. And when they got to his cafe, he kept looking over his shoulder at the door. And when Alvenia found out what was happening, she got so mad. She was just like, "This is not my job here. Like, why have you brought me in here?" And so him seeing her as someone that could be that emotional rock for him as he was opening up his relationship with his daughter just really struck me. And so what you just said, just I mean, that's spot on, right? The sort of emotional labor that they're doing. In Alvenia's case, she wasn't just hired for a job, right? As personal business liaison, what she was doing exceeded sort of what was written in her contract, right? And that expectation that she would just step up and do it. But yeah, so thank you for that. Some of the other things I was thinking about, the urgency of our works, and just listening to you read your work, both of you, and also reading the materials that you shared with us. It was great to have this, because so much of it echoes what I'm trying to do with Alvenia's story, right? Thinking about these stylistic and cultural contributions of Black women that have been elided from the dominant narrative, particularly in rock and country. And so how we center Black women and foreground their interests and their desires, right? As opposed to being sort of the center of the white male gaze in many ways. Maureen, in your book that's coming out, Alvenia shows up a couple times, right? And she's not a well-known person, but she does show up in some memoirs. And so you were quoting Eric Burden, talking about her, describing Alvenia as a Black beauty. And so the two of them dated briefly, I think it was in 1970. And he also talked about her as being stunningly attractive, tall, brown, and beautiful, an instant hit with the boys in the band War. And when I read this, I was just kind of chuckling, because while Burden spends so much time talking about his sexual attraction to Black women, the way Alvenia talks about her relationship is void of any sexual interest, right? So it's important to hear the objects of these men's lust, what they have to say about their understandings of who they are and what's important to their stories. And so I think really focusing on their voices and their experiences is so important. And both of you do that so well in your writing and your research.
So I think one of the things that Maya's comments just pointed to has to do with the challenges of doing this kind of work, because of the way African-American women's voices have been so often marginalized. And so even though there are a lot of examples of women writing their own stories, when you go to the sort of mainstream of the sources, their voices are not there. And when I was doing my research, I was always looking in somebody else's biography, because these women didn't have their own biographies, for the most part, or their own memoirs. And so I was so excited, Maya, when I learned that you were doing this project, because it's an opportunity to hear the voice of a person who was there in this community in the counterculture in the late 60s and the early 70s, that's been so celebrated and mythologized. And the presence of people of color has really been almost completely erased or suppressed, so that even when there are people who are very obviously African-American, for example, they're talked about as exceptions. So Jimi Hendrix or Sly Stone are these exceptions, kind of oddly there. People might mention someone like Arthur Lee and the band Love. But to think that, no, there were people who were present and integrated and active and kind of everywhere, like always at the show or always at the party, I think is important, because it gives us a different feeling of what the scene was. And so I think it's such an important voice, an important piece to have in the story. And with Francesca's work, that was such a beautiful reading, and I really appreciate your sharing something that had such a rich range of the sort of historical details and then these very personal, emotional responses to them. And it made me think about the sort of risks associated with going back to that history, not only for you as the writer who's doing this excavation, but for the native daughters, because there's a lot of pain associated with the banjo and with the imagery, even as you kept repeating, the minstrel banjo, that's hard to absorb in a way. And so thinking about the work that they have to do or that they are doing as they're bringing this music forward and trying to make it accessible for African-American audiences who may not always want to hear banjo or think back on those times, and also make it accessible for non-African-American audiences in a way that it's not spectacle, but so that the seriousness of what their work is about comes through is a real challenge. And so I think for you, I'm just really eager to hear which directions this work is going to go as you keep moving forward with your own banjo playing, but especially with your writing about it.
Should I jump in first, Maya, or do you want to respond first? What do you think?
No, please do.
Okay. Well, I really appreciate the question about the seriousness and the painfulness of the project, kind of the ways that this instrument carries shame with it, and also just like the reality of lost lives and violence. So I think that's real. And I think that, to have Rhiannon Giddens as a resource for writing about the banjo is just so, such a gift, because she herself, she has a scholar's interest in these details and complex stories and really excavating things. But she also is very transparent about the emotional labor, but in a way that has more agency of doing this work as well, and the impact of it. And she writes about that. So, so I really admire her, and I try to use her as a kind of model for going in there and getting to the messy parts of it. But another part of the essay is looking at, the essay looks at really almost all the songs, not all of them, but songs that were written by each of the artists of Our Native Daughters. And for Rhiannon, I looked at Mama's Crying Long, which is her song that she based on a children's hand clapping game that was really about a child's witnessing of his mother's lynching. And there's a video that you can look at on YouTube where we see the process of, writing and collaborating with the other women to perform the song. And you can really see the cost, the psychic cost of kind of entering into the point of view of this child and telling this story, and just the way that in order to get the story out, she's really depending on the other women and the other musicians and the producer, Dirk Powell, like their presence and their own attentiveness and seriousness. So I think that for her, and also for me too, like I think bringing other people in the room is really important to the aspect of doing that work, and just kind of recognizing that it has a cost, for sure.
No, I'll jump in here because listening to you read, Francesca, and getting emotional, I wrote you after I read the materials that you had shared with us, because I was just so overwhelmed with how beautiful you create these the scenes and sort of convey the emotional, the affect of what's going on. And so your narrative voice gives me chills when I read it, and I strive to do the same in my writing. So thank you for that. You know, and I enjoy these autobiographical moments, even though I don't have the same relationship to country as you do, although I adore, you know, Dolly Parton and Bonnie Raitt and some of these other performers. You talking about your experiences of growing up, this was in the Black Eden's article, you know, your opening paragraph about being a tomboy and watching your friendships with boys dissolve as you got older, and my having that same experience really resonated with me. And of course, the intersectionality of your work, how you explore Blackness and queerness in country, is so long overdue. And that really speaks to the urgency of getting this out at this moment, because I'm sure there's so many people out there who have similar experiences, but don't know how to articulate it because it hasn't been spoken up about. So thank you for that. And also just thinking, something that stood out to me about your work, when you were talking about sort of the early roots of country and blues, you know, and how no one really knows that. As an East Texan myself, and as a scholar of Francophone studies, I kept comparing this to discussions of Cajun music, right? And how Black musical influence and Black musicians have been sidelined from that. So it'd be really interesting to do a joint project at some point. I think that would also relate back to sort of my background, my studies, my academic background. But yeah, this emotional labor, just working with Alvenia on this project has been quite difficult, right? Because she now has the rough draft that I've given her. And even though I've worked really hard to faithfully sort of render what she has told me, and I'm working from transcribed interviews, her reactions to some of the things she sees on paper have quite surprised me. And we started this 6 years ago. So what she's telling me 6 years ago and what's happening now, and especially in this time where there's just so much stress between, living in New York with COVID and dealing with, a landlord who's been trying to evict her for years and all these things, and trying to understand what is it about her telling her story is having such an emotional impact when her biggest dream in life is to get the story out, right? And so just thinking about that emotional impact that putting your words on paper has, and knowing that others are going to share in that. So yeah, I've been thinking a lot about sort of affect and emotions and writing this.
Thank you anyway for those great comments. And yeah, I was really thinking about emotions, the emotional work of doing the writing too when I was reading Black Diamond Queens. And I loved the parts in the book, Maureen, where you kind of enter into your own experience of consuming music as well, and kind of letting us in on your own kind of listening against the grain, and even the ways that maybe this would be a book that you would have wanted to read when you were younger, but that you didn't even know that you needed to read it. And so, yeah, just thinking about for me, that it's always a challenge to be honest about those moments where, you may not have known the right questions to ask, or known all the questions to ask. And so I appreciated the inclusion of that in the book. But I'd love to hear more about your choosing to include those personal parts. And I know that, Maya, when we were chatting, you referred to your book as a double memoir, right? So also thinking about, I was also wanting to hear from you too about the process of mediating, your own voice and how to do that. So.
Well, I'm supposed to be an anthropologist, and so in anthropology, it's actually very typical to have the author's voice in the text. As I went to this place and I met these people and I asked these questions and here's what I learned. So you're writing your ethnographic report. So I thought I was comfortable with that form, but I found that when I actually sat down to try to write that part of the book, that it was very difficult, because it was attached to this project, but it was different from what I was accustomed to, which is, you know, it's connected to this research project, and I just need to tell you, you know, quickly who I am. I can get in and out of that story in, you know, 5 sentences, and then get on with the research part. I was strongly urged to include some aspect of my personal story by Guthrie Ramsey, who is a colleague. And in his book, Race Music, he spends the first, you know, in the first couple of chapters, he includes a lot of information about his family, about his background, and about his relationship to music, because he's, you know, trying to make an argument about the location of this music in African-American culture and communities. But I think his rationale was, I needed for people to know who I was to do that. And I tried to take his advice to heart. And I think because I was, you know, writing about this thing that was very close to me, it made it really, I mean, my feelings about music and this relationship to music and a relationship to music that I've known all along was weird, because Black people were not supposed to listen to rock and roll. At least that was the discourse at the time that I was growing up. I did feel a lot of discomfort, you know, telling the story. And I probably labored over that section, which is at the very end of the introduction, for longer than any other part, because I was trying to figure out the balance. I didn't want it to be like so self-indulgent, like who cares, just get on with the, you know, stories about these other women. But I did think there was I did think it was important to include it, because we don't really hear that many stories about Black women you know, engaging with rock. We have, you know, Daphne Brooks talking about that in Grace. We have Lena Dawes talking about it in What Are You Doing Here? But they're not a whole lot of examples. And so I felt like this was an opportunity to provide an example. And certainly it's the example I know the most about, because it's my own story. So there it is. We'll see how it flows.
Well, I'm glad you were convinced to do so, because it flows really well. I really enjoyed that part of the introduction. And just like Francesca, you have a very powerful narrative voice, and it really shines at that point. And it was funny too, when you wrote on page 23 about how you were in high school and you never would have dreamt of writing about the Rolling Stones. I exclaimed when I read that. I was like, that's the same with me. But yet here we are, right? Like, and so I connected with that. And I think a lot of readers, especially Black women readers, will connect with that as well. So thank you. And Francesca, your question about the double memoir, you know, originally when Alvenia asked for me to write her memoir and I accepted, I hadn't planned to insert my voice, but I do have training as an ethnographer. I do think it's important for how I'm understanding her story, for people to understand how I'm understanding her story, especially because we have very different ways sometimes of looking at these sort of incidents and experiences in her life, partially because I'm an outsider, right? And but partially just because of the generational difference. You know, she says time and time again that she doesn't like to think about race, right? She talks about sort of the trauma around living in segregated Kansas, where one of her most formative experiences was being tasked with integrating a school and failing because she fought back when, you know, people started throwing Coke bottles at her and whatnot. And so for her, talking about race is just reliving sort of this really, really difficult past. And so she likes, you know, she espouses a sort of colorblind mentality, which is very, you know, it's antithetical to sort of what I write about, right? And so I wanted to make sure I wasn't muddling her voice and what she was saying, but also giving space for me to sort of critique critique this. But what's interesting is, even though she doesn't like to think about race, she talks about her Blackness and her womanness all the time, right? And how she navigated these spaces. So I think it's really important to bring this up. And so I thought it would stay truer to both of us if there were two voices in there. So I wouldn't be putting words in her mouth, but I would also be really sort of articulating what I saw was going on in these experiences. So.
Well, this is such a great conversation. And it just strikes me how, as well as kind of emotional risk, what we're talking about is also like physical risk that has come up in all the, in the examples that we've been talking about. So maybe, do you think that we should open up to the larger conversation and go from there?
Perfect.
All right. Yeah, great. Wow, thank you so much. This is so fantastic. And there are some questions. And so I'll just call on people. And if you could just unmute and ask your own question, that'd be great. So Emily had a question first.
Hi, did I unmute myself successfully? Okay, terrific. Hi, thank you for this. This is so great. I'll cut to the chase because I know other people have a lot of questions. But what I was thinking as I was listening to all of your, really wonderful work, and the way that you're sort of featuring first-person accounts by Giddens, Bridges, obviously, and Santigold, is just that kind of problem or the challenge of the oral history wherein you want to take these Black women subjects sort of as the authorities, of course, right, on their own experiences and what they thought, think that they are doing, take them at their word. But part of taking those words seriously is also, right, reading them critically and understanding a lot of these women as being engaged in very strategic processes of sort of self-fashioning, even self-mythologization. And so Maya just sort of touched on this in what you just said, is that I think one way that you are navigating that perhaps is sort of playing your own voice against that of Alvenia Bridges. But I would just love to hear you all sort of discuss the challenges of both taking your subjects at their word, their crucial word that we don't, often have enough of, while also acknowledging that that there's more sometimes than meets the eye in terms of what they're saying about certain things.
Yes, definitely. I won't say much more since I've already talked about this a little bit, but this is one of the most difficult things I'm contending with. And I write what she tells me, but then I go and do research because I want, I'm a scholar, and so I want to sort of make sure things are lined up, and what are other people saying about these sort of incidents. And I mean, some of them are major. It's like her experience being around Jimi Hendrix right before he dies. And I know there's going to be a lot of contestation when that comes, and I'm just kind of biting my nails because it's, it's her recollection, but also everything else that's been written is also their recollections as well, right? And so who's to say that other people who have written about this have the definitive word, right? So I definitely want to give her due and give her space to put that out there. It's also interesting because this is a co-authored, right? Like we're both the authors of this book. At least that's how we're putting it out. I thought it was really important that both our names be on there. And so as we're in this sort of editing phase, I don't know what's going to be taken out, what she's going to say, no, I don't want that in there, or something like this. This is still all to come. And so I've been thinking about, okay, what are ways, like, do I do another project where I can sort of give more power to my voice, right? If the final project, because I do want to protect what she wants to share, right? And so we shall see. It's a balancing act, and I don't know where it's going to land.
Okay. So Anne has a question next. If Anne wants to unmute.
Yeah, got it. Okay. Hi, y'all. That was amazing. And I got a little choked up too, Francesca, when you were reading. So thanks for my afternoon moment of tears. I needed that. And I also want to say, before I ask my question, which is more for Maureen and Maya, that I want to thank you, Francesca, for specifically describing the banjos of the women in Our Native Daughters. I really think it's so important to talk about the musicianship of these women and the specific choices they make musically. So that was a really wonderful, edifying detail. Thank you for that. My question has to do with the subject of behind the scenes movers, women movers in popular music, specifically in rock and roll. And, you know, the term groupie, I'm going to say it. Maureen says it in her book. It's out there. Definitely, it was a term of both derision and praise in the period we're talking about, especially the 60s, 70s, I think. And I was curious to hear from both of you, working with someone who was a behind the scenes person at the time, Alvenia, and also what you're writing on people, including like Devin Wilson in your book, Maureen. How do you think about your work in relationship to the previous waves of work on that subject? And I was specifically curious about like Pamela DeBar and the kind of heritage of her and other women who've kind of really embraced that role and created a mythology around it. And how do you see your work in relationship to that work?
So I think, you know, the challenge with dealing with Devin Wilson, who was known as a super groupie because of her association with, primarily with Jimi Hendrix, but also with others, including Mick Jagger, is that she left very little behind in terms of any kind of, you know, narrative or documentation. There were a few interviews that I was able to use. She died in 1971, so there's not that body of material. You know, in contrast, Pamela DeBar's is written, you know, from a period of distance, written a story about what her experiences were. So there's such an imbalance. I think, you know, one of the things is that the image of the groupies that I think that even comes out in I'm With the Band is that it was an all-white scene. Although if you look at the groupies article, the groupies and the other girls in Rolling Stone in, I guess it's 1969, they're photographs of Black women who were part of this scene. So I think, you know, all the things, I mean, I did have that sort of respectability, I don't know what to call it, anxiety, like of all the things all the places I'm going to place Black women, I'm going to place them in the groupie scene. How good is this? But I did think that it was important to do because it was a way of expressing a kind of liberation and a freedom that they hadn't accessed previously. And I think it's significant because it was happening across lines of race, where the women were, in their minds, they were empowering themselves and having liaisons with white men as well as Black men. And that was something that had always happened, but now it was coming up a little bit more above ground. So the other two women that I talk about in the, I guess we could call it the groupies chapter, it's the Brown Sugar chapter, were also musicians. So they were also, and artists trying to have careers. And then they also were kind of in this other role as, you know, partners with very well-known, very visible musicians. And so I was trying to talk about both sides of what they were doing, but, and in the cases of Claudia Lanier and Marcia Hunt, those men always followed them into any kind of coverage that their careers were getting. So if you talked about Claudia Lanier in an article, you always were going to mention that she was known to have been with Mick Jagger, that she might have been the woman who inspired Brown Sugar. And there was always some comment that she would have to make about him. So they're not able to completely put that aspect of their lives to the side. So I kept that, I tried to keep that dynamic in the book as I was writing their stories, because those two sides were very much a part of their stories.
I could just jump in real quickly. I mean, if you ask Alvenia, what she would think of being seen as a groupie. I mean, she would
Horrified.
not. Huh?
Would she be horrified?
She'd be horrified. Well, I don't know if she'd be horrified. She didn't see anything wrong with groupies. And she's used that word before. I know she was referring to Judy Wong as a groupie because they were all staying in Pat Hartley and Dick Fontaine's apartment in London at the same time, right? And so she used that term sort of affectionately, right? There was no sort of, yeah, it wasn't a negative term for her, but I don't think she would see herself. The way she tells her story, it's a lot of happenstance. She just happened to be in a certain place at a certain time. I mean, she went to London to work on her modeling career. She moved there from Geneva and Portofino, and she just knew Pat and Dick, and they offered her a place, right? And then she ended up in this scene. She was talking about not really understanding rock and roll. She had no interest in rock and roll, and Eric Burden was like explaining to her who were these performers. You know, so the groupie thing, it'll be interesting to think about that as I'm editing the book. Yeah, thanks for your question.
No, I just want to add that I think what you're doing, the work you're doing with Alvenia, all of this, the work, Maureen's work too, it's enriching this narrative. And you know, I always think of it now, I think when I was a lot younger, it was sort of I think I romanticized the groupie idea under the influence of Pamela DeBar, whose writing I quite enjoy. It's so full of life. I love that about it. But I think about it now in connection so much with like these other behind the scenes women, like Cherry Vanilla, she, you know, who was kind of Bowie's business manager, or Frida, the woman, what's her name? Frida Kelly, who was the Beatles' secretary. There's a great documentary about her called Good Old Frida. And, you know, there's this network of women that supports, that creates rock and roll in a lot of ways, you know, and certainly creates 60s rock. And so anyway, I just wanted to say, to me, it's like a web of different kinds of stories. And I'd be interested to see how, I'm excited to see how these stories, you know, play into that and connect with that. Yeah.
The other thing that I found so interesting, Maya, in your telling of Alvenia's narrative is this sort of beneath the scenes or behind the scenes network of Black women working together so that she gets her start in this thing that, you know, maybe she's going to be able to excel at, maybe not because she hasn't done it before, but she's able to work for Roberta Flack in a certain way, and Roberta Flack training her to do this kind of work allows her to go, you know, make her next steps. So I think seeing those kinds of networks is really cool as well.
She definitely cherishes those networks, and throughout the book she talks about particularly Black women, but also Black men who have sort of helped her find her just where she fits in the space.
All right. So actually, the next question was my own, but I think it was mostly answered. I was just interested in the impulse to sort of bring your own first-person narratives in as you engage these other first-person narratives, and you sort of already answered that. I mean, I guess the second part that I was going to ask is, do you think it's especially important for you to include your own narrative given the erasure of Black women's voices? Is there an extra urgency there? I don't know if you want to answer that, but.
I think definitely, you know, it's even the fact that the three of us on this panel are all Black women talking about her experiences in these spaces, I find really fascinating. And that connection with the people we interview, right? And how do they relate to us as Black women? Do they tell their stories differently because we are Black women? I think it's important to be able to position yourself and acknowledge what you bring to the storytelling and story making.
Yeah, and I think that when my own choice to kind of often kind of foreground the personal is really about, I think, highlighting the role of music in world making, in Black women's lives and queer people's lives, and really kind of offering up the ways that that music is part of our a shared history, but it's also a part of making futures that people use really directly. So I try to kind of put myself in that role, but also try to use my ear to hear how other people are also doing that in the ways that they tell their stories.
So Gail had a question, and Gail has left, so I can go ahead and read it. So Gail asked, said she'd love to hear more about working with living subjects who have their own investments in the storytelling. Kind of talked a little bit about that, but I don't know if you want to say more.
I mean, I'll just say it's difficult. It can be difficult. It's great in some ways, right? Because you can keep going back to them if you have that sort of relationship, and you know, run things by them and see if you're on the right track and understanding their lives, right? Making sure you're honoring them and doing them justice. But also, it's difficult when they sort of push back against what you're saying, whether it's because of, you know, anxiety about respectability, or whatever it is that might cause them to have second thoughts, especially with the idea of their life story being out there for public consumption, right? And so sometimes I think you might have to forego sharing something that you think should be out there. And that can be really hard as a scholar and an academic, right? And so yeah.
I think the dynamic I experienced was actually very different from what Maya is talking about, because I was really functioning more, it was almost more like a journalistic interview, or, you know, a research interview, where, for example, I was able to speak with Beverly Lee of the Shirelles, and I was so happy that I was able to, because there's very little interview material with any of the Shirelles, and I wanted to be able to tell something of their story, but it was really, you know, it was like a very formal, just about your professional experiences, you know, your memories, you know, factual stuff about who the producer was and how they worked together. And so certainly those things can be, those are recollections. The Shirelles were recording in the late 50s and the 1960s, so it was a long time ago when these things happened. But those were different types of stories than, I think, the kinds of details that Maya is working with in her project with Alvenia. You know, and then the other thing, I think, for anyone who's on this call who does interviews with professional musicians, you know that, well, some of you are journalists, so you actually have loads of experience doing these interviews, but generally the people who you're interviewing have much more experience being interviewed than, at least for me, I have experience conducting interviews. And so, I mean, one of the things that I included in the book had to do with my experience interviewing Betty Davis, because for me, it was such a humbling and challenging experience. And she is a very nice, you know, kind person. It wasn't that she was being mean. It's just that she is not a loquacious person. And so for someone, and we were doing a phone interview because she doesn't do in-person interviews. So for someone who was trying to, you know, pull stories out and, you know, I'm going to pause for a little while, you can just fill in the silence, and to be talking with someone who doesn't roll that way, that part was really challenging. And so I think, you know, all of us in doing work on anything that has to do with, you know, trying to capture some history, we have to live with the fact that we're never going to know all of the details. We're never going to get all of the stories, because some of them are they're just lost to the ages. And so I've been thinking a lot about Devin Wilson and how, you know, is there a way to tell more of her story? What would that take? And how, you know, who to ask and what to ask, but always knowing that there's going to be a big piece of it it's just elusive. And so the thought that, you know, if the person is here, I'll be able to find out something. I actually know that that's not true. There's no guarantee that I'm going to be able to find it out just because, you know, I'm on a phone call with them asking them a bunch of questions. And that's the agency of the interview subject, where they can just, you know, put up a wall. They don't really have an answer, and there you are.
I'll just say that as someone trained in literature, I'm totally new to the idea of working with people who are still alive and who have an opinion about what you write about them. So I'm still working on that as well. And I am used to kind of the strategy of representation and interpretation and performance, which is just so different, but I think really needs to be opened up and challenged. So right now, the chapter that I read is, you know, at the desks or whatever of Rhiannon Giddens, Amethyst Kaya, Layla McCullough, and Allison Russell, and I'm waiting to hear what they think. But I haven't interviewed them directly, so I'm kind of nervous. But I think it will only enrich what I have to say.
All right, so our final question, Antonia has a question if you want to unmute.
Yeah, thank you all for such. I was really waiting on this presentation about Black women in rock because I'm a Black rock fan too, and female. My question was about, is there some different sort of stakes involved in acknowledging Black women's contribution to pop music versus rock music? I'm thinking especially about how there's been a lot of work recently written about how the sound of pop music, white pop artists, is borrowing heavily from the sound of Black pop musicians. But one of the things you all are bringing forth is that there might be different stakes in acknowledging the role of Black women in rock music. So that was my question.
Yeah, I do. Thank you for that question, Antonia. I do think the stakes are different, although, you know, it's this funny phase that we're in with rock being not so important, not so ascendant, and it's really pop and R&B that are, and hip hop. So, but still, in terms of representation and I guess the mythologizing around a certain genre, rock has this aura. And it's a place where so much critical work has been done, so much critical pop music writing or popular music writing has been done. So I think there is a slightly different thing happening to make that claim about Black women in rock, partly because I think people would be more comfortable and less questioning of Black women's influence in pop. That I think it would be more, that seems more almost common sense in some ways, even though you might have to, you know, go back and forth with a few arguments. I think with rock, because it has been so racialized as white since the late 1960s, you're really having to push back against that. And so, you know, you have examples of things like the Black Rock Coalition, and then, you know, currently with the popularity of Afropunk that are pushing back, but there's still that sense that you have to push back against an assumption that Black people aren't involved in this. So I think that does make the stakes different.
Okay, well, thank you so much. This was fantastic. I was looking forward to this ever since the series started, so I'm really happy we got here. All right, so thank you to Maureen, Francesca, and Maya. And please join us on November 10th. At this time, it'll be at 4 o'clock instead of 5 for a conversation about Billy Joel. We're gonna hear from Joshua Dushan and Ryan Raul Banagal, editors of We Didn't Start the Fire, Billy Joel, and Popular Music Studies, along with contributions, the contributors Dan Trout and Catherine Metz. So I hope to see you all next week. Well, 2 weeks, sorry, 2 weeks.